Brendan, so you run the Employee to Entrepreneur podcast, and I'm curious, why did you go from employee to entrepreneur, and what did you do to make that move from, you know, pharmacist to being in sales and running some side businesses?
Yeah, man, that's a loaded question. When I was actually in pharmacy school back like 10 years ago, or more now, I guess. Wow, it's crazy to think it was that long ago. I actually thought about quitting in my first year because I knew that like I was not going to be passionate about it. I just wasn't into it, right? Like I knew what it was like to be passionate about things. My first love was like fitness, like working out. I was into bodybuilding. I did some bodybuilding shows in high school and college and stuff, but realized that I didn't really want to make that my career. And so I looked at other things. I looked into being a dentist, pharmacist, etc. My parents really pushed me into being a pharmacist. Like that's really what they wanted for me. And so that's why I ended up doing it. And so my parents came to Gainesville, Florida. I went to the University of Florida in Gainesville, and they were like, fine, you can quit, but what are you going to do instead? And I didn't have an answer for them. I had no idea at the time. And so I just continued on, and I genuinely gave it my best shot in pharmacy to try to like actually be passionate about it. Like I started watching, because when I went through a residency, started working for a hospital, started in the ER, like emergency medicine, which if you would think that if there was going to be anything that was like even remotely exciting about doing clinical pharmacy, it would be like being in the ER and seeing gunshot wounds and, code blues and strokes and all that kind of stuff. And so I really tried to like watch the documentaries. I got on Twitter back then, 10 years ago or 7 years ago ish, when the free open access medicine movement was a thing. I was trying to learn from like other doctors. And I could understand at the time like why certain people do get passionate about this, but it just never happened for me. Like it never clicked. And so after a year or two of trying that, I started reading about things that I was genuinely interested in. And so I went through a couple phases, like trading options. I got really big into poker. Realized I kind of liked those types of like, I like numbers, I like money, I like the risk, etc. And it took me a while until I started stumbling upon. I think the big turning point for me that was like my financial red pill moment, if you will, is when I read Rich Dad Poor Dad. I read it way too late, man. Like it was like the end of 2019, early 2020, right before the pandemic hit. And I realized then I'm like, man, what the hell am I doing? Like I'm definitely not like I'm on the slow lane to, working 9 to 5 until you die type of thing. And, hopefully have enough money there. And by the time you retire and everything. And so it was then that I was like, okay, I'm going to look into like this whole business thing. And I dove super deep into it. Whenever I go in to get passionate about something, I go all in, right? And I'm reading all these books. The Millionaire Fastlane's a great one. That was a big one for me back then. And it led me to eventually the first thing that I tried with in terms of internet money, in terms of entrepreneurship, was something called rank and rent lead generation. So it's the idea where you build this website for a particular niche in a particular city, and then you rent it out to a contractor in that city. So to give you an example, it'd be like plumbers in New York City. So you build a website around plumbers in New York City. You rank it high in Google, so that's the first thing to come up when people type in plumber near me up in New York City, and then you rank it out or you rent it out to somebody, right? And it actually it worked fairly well back then. It was a pretty good opportunity back then, and I made a little bit of money doing that, but I never really got to the point where things were doing that great. But the other thing I realized, having doing that and started to do some like SEO work and building websites and more digital marketing type stuff with the social media marketing, etc., started branching out and then into all that. I eventually realized that it wasn't so much the marketing, like the ops and everything, that I genuinely enjoyed doing as much as it was the sales process. So eventually pivoted into sales, and started doing that more full time, but I still have my side businesses and everything. But sorry, this is a really long-winded answer for you. But the reason why I decided like pharmacy wasn't for me, like why I didn't want to do pharmacy, was there was multiple things, man. I was just genuinely unfulfilled, could never get passionate in it. I was really worried about the idea of something replacing my job eventually, like robotics or AI. And now we're really kind of seeing, how fast AI is taking off right now. I think that the job of pharmacist will be replaced completely by AI and robotics eventually. I'm not saying it'll happen anytime soon. I'm sure it'll be like 10, 20 years from now. But I was worried about that. Was worried about a saturated job market. And then the pandemic hit, and there was all these employer mandates and all that kind of stuff. And I realized, like, having a job isn't as secure as some people think it is. Like, people think of being an employee as being the safe route, right? Like, you have that job or whatever, but that's not really true. You're dependent on your employer to keep you around, right? And I think I'm surprised that more people didn't have that light bulb moment back in the pandemic when so many people got laid off or fired, or businesses went under. I'm just surprised that more people didn't have that moment. If you look at like the data from the pandemic, there was a surge of people opening up their own businesses, and those are by and large online businesses, which was great. I was just hoping that it would kind of continue from there. But yeah, man, I just want to be able to make an impact in the world, and I didn't really feel like I could do that in pharmacy. I felt like I was wasting my life, to be honest with you. And I just sat in the pharmacy, and I was like, there's no way I can do this for like 30 years. There's just no way.
What impact did you want to make on people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, it starts with my family. I'm a family man first and a businessman second. So when I think about, some of my motivations for transitioning out of pharmacy and being an entrepreneur and owning my own business so that I can have like an unlimited income, it's a lot of that comes from the things that I want to do with my family that I can't do in pharmacy. Where I was at in pharmacy, I was already making the most that I would be making. There was nowhere to go from there. Like, I was already at the top of like what I could make. I couldn't make any more than that. I was making like 180K a year, which is good money. It's not, I'm not complaining, but I wanted more than that for multiple reasons. I wanted to be able to retire my wife. I wanted to be able to have a big family. I wanted to be able to control my schedule and take time off when I want to travel a lot and take my kids to see other countries. I want to be able to homeschool my kids. I think that's really important for me because I think our traditional didactic educational system, quite honestly, sucks. It's outdated at this point. And so there's a lot of motivation that stems from just trying to make an impact with regards to my family and my legacy, to be able to leave a legacy, right? But for me, entrepreneurship has been a journey of self-discovery too. And what I mean by that is, if you were to ask me like 5 years ago if I would be interested in doing sales, I would have thought you'd be crazy. Like, but now I love sales. And I would have never known that if I didn't like start my own little digital marketing agency and then realize eventually that, hey, I'm actually kind of like sales and I'm good at sales. Maybe I should try this a little bit more. And so I think with regards to the impact that I want to make on the world in particular, I'm still discovering that to a degree, but I do have a mission to help guys like me, aspiring dadpreneurs. So men who have families that are trying to escape the rat race. And that's what my podcast is about, the employee to entrepreneur. So my mission is to help 1,000 dads escape their 9 to 5s, kill their jobs, etc. And the reason that's my mission is because I think that there's a little bit of a dearth of support in education and community for men like that, because we are a small group. There isn't that many of us. Like, most men that have a family, I think a lot of times maybe are too busy, or like they might even sadly like kind of let their dreams die a little bit so that they can just work the job and support the family type of thing. But there's some of us that still want more for our lives, right? It's really hard to be a father and an entrepreneur at the same time. And so you have to be extra crazy to do it. But that's my target audience. That's my target person that I would like to make an impact on.
Why do you think it's harder as a dad and to be an entrepreneur? Is it because of like the potential risk that it has and uncertainty, or like why is it hard?
Yeah, that's 100% part of it, right? When you're young, if I could go back in time when I was 18 years old, I would have been an entrepreneur then. Because the thing is, you have nothing to lose then. You don't have a net worth. You don't have hardly any responsibilities to take into account, right? But when you're older, like me, like you're 30, when you start trying to be an entrepreneur, in my case, I had a wife, a house, a daughter, a dog, like cars, etc. I had a lot to lose, right? The stakes are a bit higher versus when you're just 20 something years old. You don't have any of those things, or maybe you have a little bit of a net worth, but can't be that much. Um, if you try and fail and go bankrupt, who cares? Start again. The stakes are so low then. But when you already have established a little bit of a life, you have a family to feed, man. Like it's you have to be much more careful about getting that done. I think some people say for instance you're 30 and you don't have a family. You do still probably have a little to lose in the sense that like you have more of a net worth built up and that kind of thing. But I think those types of entrepreneurs are much more apt to take a burn the boats approach. And what I mean by that is they just jump in and they don't try to transition slowly out of their job, right? Because they can go all in that way, right? They kind of force it. It's like a sink or swim approach, in other words. And I think that there's something to be said for that for sure. Like, you kind of, you force it, right? Like your back's up against the wall, you got to make it happen. But when you have a family, I'm not saying you can't do that, but that's a lot harder to do. Like that. And so that most people that are in my position that have a family and are trying to build a business, become entrepreneurs, is they have to stay in their day job for a while they build their business up to the point where it's at least replacing most of the income that you make from the day job. On top of that, you probably should have, X amount of months worth of savings saved up so that if things do go wrong, because they often do in entrepreneurship and business, your income goes up and down. Whereas with a job, it often stays pretty level. So you have to have savings saved up and you got to build it up slowly. And so and even if you didn't have any of that, you still have so much less time than somebody that doesn't have a family, right? You realize that once you become a parent, like, or even just a husband, that you have a lot less time to yourself, and now you're living so much more for other people. And so it's the risk, it's the time factor, it's all of that, man. And I think that's why there's so much less of us, but there are those guys out there. And that's why I said I want to service those people, because there aren't too many people trying to talk to them.
If you could go back to, let's say, your 20-year-old self and go into entrepreneurship, like you said, knowing that entrepreneurship income is really unstable and getting ready to have a family, how would you prepare for that? Or like, how would you prepare going into entrepreneurship? Or which frame of mind would you go in knowing in the sense of preparing for family, if that makes sense?
So the situation is like I'm 20 something and I'm about to have a family, but I'm also starting entrepreneurship. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, something like that. Or just maybe not about to have a family, but it's something close, maybe in 3, 4, 5 years, and going in to prepare for that so that you're ready, like having savings saved up on that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think financially, I've actually had a couple guys on my podcast that started their businesses, actually left like their W-2, employee job right when, like literally right when they had their first kid. And so you have like two major life changes right then. Both of those things are going to change you um, significantly, right? Those are just having a kid is a major life change, makes you grow up fast. Becoming an entrepreneur, as I said before, is a journey of self-discovery, but it's very much a journey of self-improvement as well. And so if you were in this situation where, you were married and you were going to have a kid soon, say next year, within 3 years or whatever, there's different opinions on it, right? But you definitely do want to have more saved up than you probably imagine. Like you probably want to have like well over a year's worth of savings to live on if you have to, because when you start a business, most businesses anyway, there's always exceptions. It's going to take some time for it to get to the point where you're really making some good money. There's that yeah, I think I forget, it was Bill Gates or whoever said it, that idea that you always overestimate what you can accomplish in a year, but you underestimate what you can accomplish in 5 years or whatever it is. I think that's really true. And unfortunately, like, I think a lot of um, entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs think that, a year is plenty of time to get a business up and running and really making some good money. But in, in entrepreneurship, the years go by fast, man. It goes by real fast. Like, it feels like just yesterday that it started, but it's been over 3 years. So it takes longer than you think. That would be the first thing that I would say. So and for that reason, you want to have a lot saved up if you're in a situation where you got to provide for a family. If you're a single dude, 20 something years old, and you can bootstrap it for a while, you'll be fine. Like, you don't, as long as you're happy, like, living a modest life, then you'll be completely fine. There's no worries. And people do that all the time. But the other thing is, if you're in a position where you are about to embark on entrepreneurship and you're married and you're thinking about having kids, really, really want to get your wife on board and maybe even involved as much as possible, so that they understand, especially like what it takes, what you're doing, why you're doing it, and everything. Try to get them involved in the business if you can. I think that is great for communication and just making sure that there's an understanding there, because it can be weird sometimes when you're like balancing the two, and like there isn't a complete understanding as to why like your income is fluctuating, or why you spend so much time this week but not this week, or whatever it might be. Whereas if they're plugged in, you know, the burden is not as much on you to communicate every little thing, because it's going to be tough.
Reversing back to mentioning homeschooling your kids, because that's also a point that I'm interested in, because I plan on, when I have a family, I do want to homeschool. I am looking into that because, again, I'm not comfortable with the modern day schooling. So, like, what's the status on that right now? Like, your status on what's going on?
My kids are too young right now. They're 1 and 3, but at 3 we need to start like getting something together. And so, unfortunately, like, if I had to do it tomorrow, there's no way I would be able to swing it in terms of homeschooling my kid right now. Um, but I'm trying to get there. I'm trying to get to the point where, yeah, I can, because I want to be involved in it too. Like, in fact, I want to be involved a lot in it. I really want to teach my kids myself. Like, I don't want it to be something that my wife just does, or we just hire a tutor or something like that. I think in an ideal world, especially as they get older, you probably are going to have to hire like a professional, like a tutor. Because I think at this point in my life, like, if I had to help my teenager with like trigonometry or calculus or something like that, I don't think I'd be able to do that. Not to say that like you have to in homeschooling, depending on what you want to do, but there's so many things I think that our traditional school system doesn't teach our kids that makes me want to do that, right? But to be honest with you, because they're so young still, I haven't looked into it as much as I should, but I'll be doing that here soon, like over the next year and a half or so. I'm gonna have to like really start diving into that.
What are some of those things that traditional school doesn't teach that you want them to learn?
Man, like any of the practical stuff, and even some of the not so practical stuff that they're doing away with. And what I mean by that is like, um, they took like physical education out of schools in certain areas there, some years back. And yet we have like an obesity epidemic in the United States. It's like, what are you doing? It's so crazy. Like, I think it's so important for kids to learn about their bodies, not just like to play sports necessarily, but to be healthy. Like, that was my first love, as I mentioned. Like, learn about nutrition, learn about exercise, etc. I think that's really important. Would love to teach my kids that. Or art. That's another thing that is so downplayed today. in the traditional school system is like they really push you into the mathematics, the sciences, the STEM stuff, because they want you to be a computer programmer, an engineer, or whatever it is. You're really kind of like pushed that way, and the arts are not as encouraged. And I think that that's really unfortunate because the arts are what makes us very human, right? I think coming from a sales perspective, like we are emotional beings first, and I think that there's always going to be, even in this age of AI where we're already making AI generated images and everything, there's always going to be room for that human element for art, whether it's music or whatever, plays, movies, etc. I think that those are so important, but also philosophy, that like just teaching people how to think, literally just teaching them logic, etc. Like that used to be like a foundational, like really core element of any curriculum. If you rewind far enough, like 100 years ago, that was taught everywhere, but we don't teach that anymore. And then of course the thing that everybody talks about is like the practical skills. Like they don't teach you, your finances. They don't teach you how to balance a checkbook. They don't teach you about taxes. They don't teach you about any of this stuff. And then like, you come out of college or whatever and you have all this knowledge about like organic chemistry and calculus and all this crazy shit that you don't use in your daily life. And then all of a sudden you have to figure out how to like actually do things that you do need to do, like taxes, etc. And I think that that's all, a major shame. I think ultimately the best way to learn is by doing. And by and large, I mean, I don't know what your education experience was like growing up, but I probably read, learned, regurgitated, memorized so much stuff and then forgot it. And it's like, what is the point of that? Like, if I just go read this, regurgitate it for the test, and then forget it, why? Like, and then I never apply it. It's just such a waste of time. I think the real way to learn is, if you're going to go study something, go apply it right away, and then you'll really learn. And you get feedback. Okay, I suck at this, and I need to change this, etc. But unless you're actually going to use it, it seems pointless to just learn it, regurgitate it on the test, and then forget it. Why? Just to prove that you can take a test, I guess? It seems ridiculous.
Yeah, like I know definitely with the school system, in my view, like there's a lot of things that aren't really useful. Like there are some abstract stuff like maybe algebra, basic algebra, that in some cases that's useful. Just the basics. Maybe of course things like calculus, no one's going to use that in real life. But more of the core, I do find that useful, but there is a lot. Like I remember when I finished high school, I came out and I was like, all right, how do I do taxes? I don't know. So like what was your did you have any moment like that where you realized, oh shit, there's a lot that you need to do or you need to know how to do that you don't know how to do?
Yeah, I mean, after I came out of residency, well, even when I was in residency, that was really when I started managing my own finances. And then I realized then like how much I liked that topic. I remember watching the movie The Big Short, and I was like, man, this stuff is fascinating. Like, and that's when I kind of got into like trading options a little bit. And so yeah, I think that, fortunately, I liked it. The thing that I needed to learn in order to live finances was something that I actually took an interest in. But one of the things that I rail against all the time, like on my podcast, for instance, because I do talk about like mindset and the mindset shifts that need to occur when you're going from employee to entrepreneur. One of the things that pisses me off the most, in retrospect, of course, like I didn't know this when I'm going through the school system, but the school system almost, it does train you to be afraid of failure. It trains you to be a perfectionist, right? You only get one chance to turn in that paper, and if it's not right, then you don't get an A. And so that's why I think when you're going from, and the same thing when you're an employee, by the way, right? Like you're afraid like that to make mistakes. In other words, like you don't want to piss your boss off. You don't want to like make this mistake or whatever. But that's not how life works. That's definitely not how entrepreneurship works, right? There's a whole saying about like go fail fast, because you go make quote unquote mistakes, and that's feedback that you get, and then you adjust and you get better. That's how you get better. And same thing in like sales, for instance. Like the first time you get on a sales call, you're terrible, right? But you make tons of mistakes. that's just part of life. Like as long as you don't quit though, and you keep going, you keep iterating, keep getting better, it's not failure. It's only failure when you quit, when you just stop because you quote unquote made mistakes or failed or whatever. Um, and I think that the school system, like I said, is to blame a lot for that. I think that our school system grooms laborers, it grooms employees, but it definitely does not groom entrepreneurs. It does not teach you to think that way.
You reminded me of my first sales call when I believed the prospects when they said they'll think about it. So I just let them go. But yeah, what's the biggest mindset shift that someone has to make going from employee to entrepreneur? Because you mentioned, you know, going from not being a perfectionist. That's really important. For me, it's the thing about learning. Because I feel in school, you're taught, all right, you learn, you study, 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 and then you have the exam. Whereas in real life, the exam is a constant process. You're always writing the exam. And I feel you don't learn first. I always say there's a tweet I made. I said, learning isn't a step, it's a constant process. It should be there continuously. You don't learn how to sell, you don't learn sales, and then, all right, I've finished learning, I've become an expert, let me get into sales. You learn while you're doing it, and you learn from experience. So, what would you say is the biggest mindset shift that you have to do to make that jump?
I think that there's multiple, and I actually, I want to write a book eventually, and like have each chapter be about the mindset shifts that need to occur. That's one of them, right? The idea of perfection versus action, right? Like if you think about what Grant Cardone says all the time, just take massive action, take massive imperfect action, knowing that like you're not going to be good at anything when you first start. When you first start trying to ride a bike, you suck at that too. But if you just, as long as you keep going, you get better. And so making that mindset shift, it is an employee to entrepreneur thing. Another big one I would say is the mindset shift from scarcity to abundance. And so what I mean by that is if you ask the average employee, like, all right, how can you get more money? Like if you wanted to buy this expensive vacation or whatever, what are you going to do? And the first thing most people are going to say is like, well, I can start like saving more. Maybe I won't eat out as much. Maybe I'll cancel this subscription. Maybe I'll do that and this. The problem with that idea is that you can only save so much. You can only save to zero, right? Like you can, there's only so much you can save at any time. But if you focus on the other thing, which is how do I make more money, that there's an infinite amount of money that you can make. And I think that there is this prevailing mindset about the idea of business and entrepreneurship being a zero sum game. And what I mean by that is like, if you are making money, you're taking it from somebody else. But that's not how our fiat currency system works. By the way, money is being created literally as we speak all the time. It's literally being created all the time. That's why we have inflation, et cetera. Every time a bank makes a loan, it's not like there's a stack of cash in their vault that they're actually handing over. It's created literally out of thin air. Is it? If you don't believe me, just do the research. You'll understand what I mean eventually. But the point is, there is no shortage of success. In other words, like we can all be successful, and it takes a while for you to like really like wrap your head around that eventually, that like it's not about like an entrepreneur taking a bigger slice of the pie, because when an entrepreneur enters a space and makes things better, because that's what entrepreneurs do, is they solve problems, they add value to the world. They go out and they see some type of problem, like say in my case, like being in sales, I might see something as a problem in people's sales process, and I might specialize myself in my own business in fixing that particular process. And so I add value to the marketplace. So it's not about taking a bigger slice of the pie. It's about making the pie bigger itself, if that makes sense. So I would say that that's a really big one. Going from that scarcity mindset to the abundance mindset is another really, really big one. That is, unfortunately, I'm not really sure where that one comes from. Like I was blaming the failure mindset on school, and I think that's True. I think that is where that comes from. But I'm not really sure where that scarcity mindset comes from for most people.
Maybe war, maybe old times, older than school system.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, maybe like from like the Great Depression or something, or the Great Recession back in 2008 when like times were really tough, like financially, like it kind of it comes from fear, I think, ultimately. And maybe there isn't any one thing to blame with regards to that. I think maybe it just comes from fear. So a lot of people are just driven by fear, right? But yeah, I think that there's multiple shifts when it comes to going from employee to entrepreneur. Another one that I've actually really reflected on lately is the idea of the destination versus the journey. And so that's kind of what I mean by, or part of what I meant by like entrepreneurship is very much a journey of self improvement and self discovery. I think once you're in the game long enough, in the business game, entrepreneurship game long enough, you realize that it's not so much about the destination as it is about who you're becoming in the process. And I think that that is a prevailing attitude of employees who live for the weekend or live for that once or twice a year vacation. Is they kind of always have this event in their mind that like once I get there I'll be happy. And then if maybe they are happy, but it's a fleeting experience, right? Like it's only a small portion of your life. Um, Whereas when you're in entrepreneurship, when you control your own schedule, you control your own time, etc. And you realize how much of your own personal problems manifest themselves in your business. Eventually you come to realize like it's not about getting to 10K a month, it's not about getting to 20 or 50K a month, it's not about being able to sell my business or whatever. You fall in love with the game, you fall in love with the process. That's a huge shift in terms of happiness for people, in terms of having peace. I think a lot of like highly driven people are drawn to entrepreneurship, and that's something that I struggle with for a long time, and that's something I still struggle with, don't get me wrong, but it is something that I've been reflecting a lot on lately in terms of just focusing on the process and being appreciative for who I've become and what I'm doing now and everything I have now, rather than being like, once I get to this, then I'll be happy.
What's the biggest internal change that that journey has had on you?
Oh man, all three of those things are pretty major shifts, I would say. The biggest one, I would say, honestly, just prioritizing self improvement or mindset itself is a shift. I think it was Jim Rohn that said something along the lines of, you should work harder on yourself than you do on your job or your business. You should work harder on yourself than you do on anything else in life. And it wasn't until I got into entrepreneurship that I really started looking into a lot of self improvement stuff. So whether that's like meditation or journaling or whatever it might be, all of those things I think have had added a lot and helped me work through things and come to those conclusions that I've told you about. So just the idea of working on myself, I think, is probably the most important shift.
How do you view work-life balance? Because I know that's something that I'm curious on, and I know Alex Hormozy has said all he likes to do is work, and so he doesn't really care about work-life balance because there's nothing he'd rather do than work. And I'm just curious with people, even people similar like that. Like I'm very work focused. I like work. Apart from family, there's nothing I care about more than work. I enjoy doing my work more than anything, apart from being with family. But like, what's your view on just work-life balance in general, and work-life balance when it comes to you?
I honestly believe there's no such thing as work-life balance. I think that if you're going to be excellent at anything, it is going to take an extreme amount of time and attention devoted to that particular thing. And ultimately, especially when you're in a position like I am, when you have a family and you're trying to transition out of a job into entrepreneurship, you have to make sacrifices. In my case, I sacrificed my social life a lot. I sacrificed even my health to a degree. Like I love going to the gym, absolutely love it. But I knew that I wasn't going to be able to get there as much just because there's only so many hours in a day. And so for me, I don't look at it as work life balance as much as I look at it as life has seasons. And you might be in a particular season where you're building, or you might be in a season where you're mourning, or you might be in a season where that you're resting or reflecting or whatever it might be. And so that's, I don't look at it as like you're always, you can be ever balanced, because even when I think back to when I had plenty of time, like when I was a college student, I had basically no responsibilities. There was still so many things that I wish I could do in addition to the things that I was doing that I just couldn't get done because I didn't have enough hours in the day. Like ultimately, you can't have an amazing social life and amazing career or business and amazing family life and be able to get to the gym all the time and be able to contribute in your community at church or whatever it is and blah 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 blah. There's you have to choose ultimately. And I think, like I said, we go through phases basically, or seasons is what I like to think of it as. And I love Alex Hormozy. I think I don't agree with like literally everything that he says, um, but I think that, you know, the goal should be to build a life that you don't want to retire from, or you don't want to have the 4 hour work week or whatever. That shouldn't be the goal. Like if you're doing something that you only want to work 4 hours in a week at, maybe you should do something else. Maybe you should work on something that you genuinely love, or like you genuinely feel like you're contributing to the world, like you're getting fulfillment out of. That should be the goal. So to answer your question, yeah, I don't believe in work-life balance. I believe there's seasons, and that you ultimately have to choose and make sacrifices depending on the season that you're in.
I was watching a recent podcast with Ty Lopez, and this was something I was even discussing with the last guest. And he was mentioning the importance of improving in all the different buckets in life, not just the finance bucket, but all your buckets need to be moving up at the same time. You can't have one bucket going up, the finance bucket really high, the success bucket maybe going up, and then all the other buckets, social life, family, everything else is just bad. And you're saying that's why some of these great athletes, kickboxers, when they win the title, they just start break into tears, get depressed because they've succeeded in that bucket, but all the other buckets are low. So how does that tie in with these seasons?
How does it tie in with the seasons? So like the seasons would be that, say you have 5 6 buckets, but you only have 24 hours in a day. So the seasons are, which buckets are you choosing to focus on during those seasons? I'm not saying that it's impossible to have it all, but you know, I think for most people, unless they're just born with a silver spoon, and they inherited some, amazing business where they already have control of their time to the point where they have plenty of time and they can devote plenty of hours with their family and plenty of hours with their friends, and they only have to spend a few hours on business or whatever. Like I said, ultimately you have to choose because you only have so many hours. And so I think that I agree that there's some buckets are tied, like they're tied together. Like you can't really be great at business, for instance, unless you are improving yourself, like mentally and emotionally and spiritually. Like if that's all out of whack, you're probably not going to be that great at business unless you're just really sacrificing like literally everything else in your life, you know? So I think that some buckets, if you want to use that analogy, are like kind of tied together, like correlated, if you will. Um, but yeah, in order to get to the top, you're going to have to make sacrifices.
There's a quote by Leonardo da Vinci that I really like. He says, and I'm just going to paraphrase because I don't know the exact quote, but it's everything relates to everything. Everything is connected to everything. How you do one thing is how you do everything. How you do everything is how you do one thing. How you treat your wife is how you treat your kids, and how you treat your kids is how you treat the slave and how you treat the slave is all connected in some way. It doesn't. It may not be like the exact way. Like, of course, how you treat a stranger won't be the same way you treat your wife, but it. He says it is connected. And do you feel that also applies to the bucket thing in the sense that all the buckets are somewhat connected?
Yeah, so but I would say that that kind of relates back to the idea of like who you are personally, right? Like if you're in a good mindset, you have good emotional, spiritual health, etc., then that's going to manifest in the way that you treat each thing, you know. But I think that the idea of having it all is all comes back to again the idea of you only have a limited amount of time too. So yeah, I that's 100% true. I think that if you're if you don't treat the waitress well, like that oftentimes means that you don't treat your parents well or your kids well, like that. I think there's truth in that statement. But I think that that's has a lot to do with like who you are at your core, and that's why a mindset work is so important.
What has changed the most from back when you started your career as a pharmacist to now?
Wow, there's been so many changes. In fact, like sometimes I'll look back at even on myself that like a year ago and just see what like I was tweeting back then or whatever, and I'll like cringe a little bit. But I think that that's a good thing ultimately because it means that we're growing, right? It means that we're changing. If we don't like look back on ourselves and cringe a little bit, it might not be as fast as a year. It might be like 5, 10, even 15 or 20 years or whatever. Like you should probably be able to look back on yourself and say like, man, I would not do that today, or I wouldn't say that today. So, man, the things that changed the most, maybe my family life has changed the most. Uh, I'd like to say my financial situation has changed the most, like, but I'm not like making tons and tons of money. So, um, but yeah, I'd say probably my family life would be number one.
What has changed about your family life?
The way that I relate to my kids, my wife, etc. You have to remember again, I did become a father in that time period, and so I think a lot of some of that stuff comes from what you learn in sales, just in terms of active listening or just like Socratic selling, asking questions, cueing in on tonalities and body language and all that kind of stuff. It helps you just relate to everybody in your life, but obviously that's probably going to have the biggest impact on your family.
What's the principle that governs the way you go about life?
That's wow, that's a good question, deep question. The first thing that came to mind was just that kind of the golden rule, man. Honestly, like treat other people the way that you would want to be treated, is the first thing that comes to mind for me. And I'm Christian, so I think that makes sense. That's probably if it's the first thing that came to mind, it's probably what does. I try to, obviously I'm not perfect at that, right? At all. But um yeah, that's probably the guiding principle.
Brandon, we like to end this podcast by getting the last guest to ask a question to the next guest, getting the audience to ask a question to the next guest, as well as getting the current guest to ask a question to me. Kind of reverse Uno card. So, question for you from the last guest is, what's your way of setting higher standards and not staying complacent?
What's my way of setting higher standards and not getting complacent? I think I'm honestly blessed in this. Maybe it's a blessing or a curse, but I'm blessed in the sense that I'm almost never complacent. Like I might have short periods of time where I get a little bit discouraged and that kind of thing, but I'm always been a guy that like my problem is slowing down. And that's why, as I mentioned to you before, that was something that I had been reflecting a lot on lately is that idea of like appreciating the journey and falling in love with the journey rather than being so attached to the destination. And so when I set goals, I really try to focus on I'm a little different. Like I might be contrarian than as opposed to some people that do like the whole SMART goals thing, and they make it really specific, and they say like it's going to happen by this date, and this is what it's going to be like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not opposed at all to, having big dreams, big visions, et cetera. But when I set goals, I really try to focus on the what it is. Like, I'm all about visualizing it, and the why, the purpose behind the goal. Because I think if you really can tap into the purpose, the motivation comes very naturally. And even elevated emotions and everything. Like, if you really understand and tap into the purpose as to what you're doing and why, it just flows very naturally. But what I try not to focus so much on is the when and the how, because I think that, um, ultimately in life, it's a bit of a co-creation, if you will. Like, you might think you know how to get from A to B, but the universe has a totally different plan for you. And if you're trying to force it, like if you're trying to, like in my case, like maybe my ultimate end goal is not to use sales as my vehicle to help aspiring dadpreneurs. Maybe it's not. I think it is, but maybe it's not. But I want to be open-minded to the idea that maybe there's some other vehicle that's even better. And if I'm so focused and committed to this idea of like, this is what I have to do to get from point A to point B, I might miss that, you know? And so I think you have to be peaceful about that and open-minded to what opportunities come your way. And then with regards to the when, I always try. I think I naturally have a sense of urgency. Like I told you, I'm somebody that is always going. Like, I love to take massive action. Don't have any problem with that. Um, and so I always have a sense of urgency. I want to get things done as soon as possible, but I try not to get hung up on the idea of it like has to happen by the end of the year or whatever. And if it doesn't, then it's a failure. If it takes a little bit longer, that's fine. If it happens sooner, that's great, you know? So I try not to focus on the when and the how, and just focus on the what and the why. Um, Hope that answers the question.
I also have a more or broader way of setting goals. Mine is more compass like, in the sense that, I mean, it's probably time consuming because there's a lot of iterating, may not be the best use of time. But mine is more, what direction. I feel everyone knows generally what direction they want to head in life. Like, if you want to make more money, you have a decent idea of whether that's in a job, whether that's in business. Like, I feel you generally kind of know what you want to do. And then my approach is just compass, like just go that way and try things that are in that direction. And then you find out, no, this, you don't like this, you don't like this. And that compass just readjusts over time and you just keep following it. But I do feel there is a lot of time wasted in trial and error. And yeah, but that's my approach to it.
That's cool. I like that.
So, question for you from the audience: how much sacrifice did it take you to get to where you are, and what did you have to sacrifice?
It took more sacrifice than I'd like to admit, man. The major thing I had to sacrifice, like I told you, was probably my social life. Like, I was a guy like that was in college, and I was always the one throwing the parties. So that sucked to sacrifice that. Like, but that said, I did make plenty of friends, like through business, through entrepreneurship, and honestly, like I can relate a lot more to the people that I've met online doing the internet money thing in sales, etc., than I can relate nowadays to some of my old friends, you know? And so maybe it was more of a trade-off than a sacrifice, but my social life was a big one. As I mentioned, my health was another one. Like, that sounds really bad, that I sacrificed my health. It's not like I had like a heart attack or anything like that. What I mean by that is like I got like out of shape in terms of like I used to be a guy that was in the gym all the time. And that wouldn't be something that I would recommend anybody would sacrifice, right? But when you're a dad and you have the job in the business, like I said, there's only so many hours in the day, and the business was just more important for me in that season of my life, and so I had to sacrifice that as well. And this is hard for me to admit, but I even had to sacrifice in the short term, like time with my family. Um, that was something that something Alex Ramosi said about this idea that kind of comforted me a little bit, is that you want to build your business like when they're too young to remember rather than when they're too old to forget. And that definitely hit home for me, because when your kids are like 1 years old, they have no idea what's going on. They're not going to remember any of this. Whereas like, they're 7, 8, 9, 15 years old, like they definitely remember that. And so I wanted to build now, and sacrifice a little bit of time with my family to be able to do that. And that's not easy, man. Like that's also not something I would recommend. But this is what I meant by like, ultimately you have to sacrifice. You only have so many hours in a day, and when you're working a full-time job and trying to build a business and have a family, etc.
In retrospect, would you say those were the best sacrifices, or would you have gone through them different now?
I honestly don't know what else I would have been able to sacrifice. Like I said, I wouldn't recommend sacrificing things like family time or your health if you can help it. Um, with my case, sacrificing my social life wasn't something that I was happy to do, but it ended up being not so bad, like I said, because it was almost more of a trade-off than it was a sacrifice, because business is about people. Like you go into business and you build relationships, you network, etc. So even though I had to sacrifice like going to trivia nights at the cigar bar with my buddies and stuff like that, like I still met great people online that I would have never met if I didn't try to do this.
Because I also had to sacrifice a lot on my social life, and I feel like I'm still sacrificing on my social life. Probably could be much better. But then again, back to what you said about seasons, this just isn't the season for that. And I remember when starting my first business, in I think first 2 3 months of business, losing like contact and just that close relationship of everyone around me, and just that feeling of loneliness when that set in, and it's like all I have is just my work, all I have is just this business, and that was really daunting. And did you have something similar?
Um, yes and no. I think that I was never lonely because I have my family. It's kind of hard to be lonely when like your kids are always in the next room. You know what I mean? Um, did I miss my friends? Yeah, sure, a little bit. But there, on some level, I always knew that like even if this took like a year or two and I didn't talk to them for a year or two, and then I reached back out to them, I'd be pretty confident that they would, they'd probably wouldn't be like, they just wouldn't ignore that, but at the same time, they'd still be my friend. You know what I mean? So it's not like they were cut out of my life completely to the point where like they're not my friends anymore. Like it's, and I think on some level they understand that too. They understand that there's seasons, especially when you become a father. Like if you hang out, like if you have a group of your boys or whatever, and one dude becomes a father, all of a sudden that guy's like gone, but you understand why. You get it, it's like, yeah, I mean, that having a little baby like that, it's hard, it takes up a lot of your time. So I think that there's understanding there. And so I think that like I said, out of the three that I mentioned, that would be the one that I would definitely do again. you know, I felt the best about sacrificing rather than the idea of like when I say I sacrifice my health, again, I don't mean that like I got sick or anything like that. I just mean I got out of shape.
Are you still sacrificing health?
Yeah, more so than I'd like to. I got to the gym yesterday, but I only get to the gym maybe 3 times a week. Maybe. I'm lucky.
Because I know a couple of people that, of course, there are people that go every day, and then there are those that don't go at all. And I think it's just balancing time out and finding a way to make that balance with. But again, like in my opinion, it comes down to priorities. To me, like time is just priorities. No one's ever too busy or doesn't have enough time for anything. They just order their time in level of priorities. If you care about family and work more than health, then you'll spend time on family and work instead of health. It just works that way. But yeah, reverse card. Now, what's the question that you would like to ask me?
What inspired you to start your podcast?
I've always been interested in speaking to people, learning, especially about mindset. I like more theoretical mindset, paradigm shift. And I always like paradigm shifts, perspectives, change of perspectives, seeing things in a way that I didn't see them initially. And that always opens me up and opens my mind. It's like, I love that light bulb moment. I love that. And just trying to get more of that on the selfish side. And then on the selfless side, it's like, I know the biggest thing, at least for me, in my opinion, when going into business and on that journey is more of the internal side. And that's the part that I feel a lot of people don't talk about because you see the fancy cars, you see the work. Some people show the work, but you don't see what's happening inside because it's hard. No one can put a camera in their brain and just take pictures. It doesn't work like that. So, and I believe that everything external is is a reflection of everything internal. So to get the best life externally, you need to be as good internally. And I feel the internal part just isn't talked about as much. So I try to do that in a way that seems unselfish, but it probably is selfish in some way because I just like this conversation. I like doing this type of thing. But yeah, that's that would be my answer. What? Because I'm curious. You've been doing your podcast much longer than I've been doing mine. What advice would you give a younger, less experienced podcaster?
Make sure that you're doing it because you love it, because the podcast grind is something that it will take a long time to ever see like any type of financial return from. That's number one. Number two, make sure, if you can, to get your face and your podcast in front of other people that watch podcasts. I think that when people try to grow a podcast, the mistake that they make is that they just exclusively post it on social media. Like they'll go post it on their Facebook page, they'll tweet it out, they'll put it on their Instagram story or whatever it might be. But the thing is, the people that are consuming social media are not necessarily people that listen to podcasts. So you have to get your podcast in front of other podcast listeners. And there's a couple different ways to do that. One is get on other people's podcasts and talk about your podcast. And two is you can also create a podcast ad and sponsor other people's podcasts. So you do pre-roll, post-roll, whatever you want to do. But that way, the people that are listening to podcasts are hopefully already established podcasts, hear about yours and they're like, oh, that sounds interesting. I want some mindset hacks for entrepreneurship. I'm going to go check out the A17 podcast. And that's really how they grow. Otherwise, it's going to be a really, really long grind. It's going to be a long grind anyway. And that's why I said you make sure you want to do it like because because you like it, because you genuinely enjoy having discussions with people on whatever the topic of your podcast is. But I would highly recommend it for anybody. Honestly, I think it's fun. I really enjoy doing it. And it's been one of the best networking tools that I've ever done. I've met all kinds of really cool people from all over the world. I've had people from Singapore, Australia, Nigeria, Ukraine, Israel on my podcasts. So like, I think it's great. Like, I think it's a blast. And I would personally do it even if I never made any money from it.
Everyone go watch and follow the Employee to Entrepreneur podcast. But yeah, I've been having a problem with schedule because I'm really busy with business related things, and I've just been having a hard time posting as frequently as I probably should with the podcast because I can find guests, but getting the schedule right is problematic because they're usually business people and they're usually entrepreneurs who are fairly busy, and I'm also fairly busy. So balancing that schedule and getting a time that works for both is quite difficult, and then getting everything edited and uploaded in time for a regular schedule I've just been having problems because I started out once a week, then I moved to once every 2 weeks, and now we're on once a month. Uh, but yeah, any advice on that aspect?
Yeah, I think that consistency is key. Like when you have an audience watching your podcast, listening to your podcast, you want to make sure that they can rely on you to produce it, whatever it is. If it's once a week or once a month, stick to it as best as you can. And to that point, about what you were saying about having to scale it back, is I would start conservative. Start with once a month and then see like, okay, I can definitely handle more, bump it up to every other week, and go from there. But consistency in terms of your cadence is for sure an important thing.
Brendan, it's been great having you. I really appreciate you taking your time. Where can the people watching find you?
Yeah, my main social medias are Twitter or Instagram. So I love Twitter. Twitter's well, X now, right? It's not Twitter anymore, it's X. But that's my favorite one, honestly. It's I don't have as much traction on there as I do on Instagram, but I'm the same handle everywhere. It's I am Brendan Ryan. It's spelled BRENDAN Ryan. You can find me on Twitter, on TikTok, on YouTube. My podcast is on YouTube as well. But if you want to check out the podcast is podcast.employee, the number two, entrepreneur.co. So podcast.employee two, number two, entrepreneur.co. So, yeah, if you want to shoot me a DM. Best places are Instagram or Twitter.
Brendan, I really appreciate your time and really enjoyed this conversation. I learned a lot, both on the mindset part and the podcast part. And I really appreciate the advice and the tips that I got. Thank you, brother.